everyone, and welcome to the latest exciting episode of OPG Live, where I will answer your questions for the next hour as a captive photographer. I'm professional photographer Ian Plant.
I'm Leah Zahner.
And you're stuck with me for an hour, but this is your chance to ask me all sorts of crazy questions, all the questions that you're too afraid to ask anyone else. You can ask me, and I cannot leave the studio. They have locked me in. And I will answer your questions no matter how crazy, no matter how wild they are. That's what I'm here to do.
And I'll let them know what those questions are.
Thank you very much. Now, Leah, I'm sure you've got some announcements for everyone who is in the viewing audience today.
I do. As usual, this Q&A session is sponsored by Tamron, but we are continuing with our OPG Wildlife Photo Contest. So if you haven't checked it out already, you should go ahead and do so. There are already hundreds of people who have submitted their photos, so you don't want to miss out. The contest is running through November 30th, so you still have time to enter your best wildlife photo. You'll have a chance to win an incredible prize package. It's photography equipment and software with a total value of $1,700. You can click the banner underneath the video or the link in the description to enter your photo, and that's the way you can start to get considered for this contest. Again, that's through November 30th, so get right on that this month if you'd like to be included. Other than that, we're going to dive right into some photos. I'm keeping an eye on your questions as they pop in. I'll try to feed in any of the questions that you have that are directly related to Ian's photos as he's sharing them. But other than that, I'll just keep on collecting them. And when we get to the question and answer session, we'll start moving through as many as possible in the hour.
Sounds great. And as it turns out, I just got back from a week of photography in the Canadian Arctic. I was there photographing wildlife. So I guess I could enter the contest?
Very timely.
Yeah. Or am I contractually prohibited from entering the contest?
I would maybe assume that, but who knows?
Oh well. But yes, I was up in Churchill, Manitoba. Actually, technically, I wasn't in the Canadian Arctic. It was a few hundred miles south of the Arctic Circle. But it really did feel like I was in the Arctic. It was brutally cold. I think it was maybe about like -5, -10 Fahrenheit. And that was the air temperature with the winds, those 20 to 30 mile an hour gusting winds, probably felt like -30, -40 Fahrenheit. So it was brutally cold, but where it was bad for the people who were out there, it was great for the polar bears. And that's why I was up there in Churchill, was to photograph the polar bears. Now this is my 4th trip to photograph polar bears. The past 3 times I've gone to photograph polar bears, I've been in the Alaskan Arctic. And this, when I was in Alaska, I was actually in the Arctic Circle. And I've done 3 trips to Alaska. This was my first trip to Churchill. Now, Churchill has been like the epicenter of polar bear viewing and photography for a long time now. Of all the places in the world where you can see polar bears, it's arguably the most developed in terms of the tourist infrastructure, and people have been going up to Churchill for a long time to photograph polar bears. But this was my first time up there, and I wasn't quite sure what to expect. As I said, I've been going to Alaska, the North Shore, the North Slope of Alaska, for many years in a row, and it was a much different experience there. So in Alaska, I'm going to this place called Barter Island, which is pretty much as far east as you can go in Alaska before you hit Canada, and as far north you can go in Alaska before you hit the Arctic Ocean. So it's right on the edge of the Arctic Ocean, and the polar bears gather there every year on this barrier island that's off the coast. And there's a large number of bears that gather in a very small place. And it's been really incredible photography whenever I've gone there, because there's so many bears and they're kind of jam-packed in close to each other. So you've constantly got bears interacting. You've got cubs that are playing. You've got polar bears that are fighting. You go out there and you see polar bears all over the place. Like, I think the most I've counted at one time when I was out photographing in this area was maybe 40 or 50 bears that I could see with my eyes at one moment. It's a really incredible place to go. And so I wasn't sure what to expect with Churchill. And Churchill is a lot different. So Churchill is spread out over a much larger area. There's a big land area on the shore of the Hudson Bay where the bears are roaming back and forth. And they're just waiting for the sea ice to come in. So they gather in this place towards the end of the summer, beginning of winter, waiting for the Hudson Bay to freeze over. And as soon as that happens, they will head out on the ice and they will spend the entire winter on the ice hunting seals. That's their main source for food, and that's what they really love. Now, I can't imagine why anyone in the middle of an Arctic winter would want to head farther north and be out there for months on end. But that's exactly what the polar bears do. They love nothing more than to be out there. That is the weather, those cold, brutal conditions that drive everything and everyone else away. That's what the polar bear is really looking for. And that is, for lack of a better way of putting it, that's their jam. And so they were gathered on the edge of the shore, waiting for the sea ice to come in. And so when I got there in the beginning of the week, there was no sea ice. By the end, the bay had frozen over, or at least large portions of it. So the bears were all exiting the land, going out onto the ice and dispersing. So by the end of the trip, there were barely any bears. But even at the beginning of the trip, there wasn't like that huge concentration of bears that I was used to seeing. So it was a lot more challenging. Spent a lot of time out in the field, driving around in a 4x4 vehicle in the area looking for bears. And the sightings were few and far between, and the sightings were also rather fleeting. Usually it was a bear walking across where the car was able to get to, and you might have 2 or 3 minutes of photographing the bears. So I think that it's fair to say that this trip was far less productive than my previous trips up to Alaska to photograph polar bears, but I did get some shots that I kind of like. So I'm going to dive into those, and if you've got any questions related to polar bears or my photos or the stories I'm telling behind those photos, feel free to chime in and let Leah know.
We do have a question already.
All right, fantastic.
Jim is asking, what made you change locations?
Well, yeah, that's a great question, Jim. And so, Alaska has been very productive to me, and I think if I go back to photograph polar bears, I'm probably going to go back there. But I was looking to do something different, and I was really curious to see what Churchill was like and how it might be different. And there are some key differences in the photography that between Alaska and Churchill. And one of the big differences is the terrain. So in Churchill, you've got a lot of rocks on the shore. You've got this rocky shoreline. So there's opportunities to get the bears up on these big rocks, which is kind of cool. And you'll see that in some of my photos. There's a lot of really beautiful scenery in Churchill. There's also a lot of scenery that isn't so great, as it turns out. There was a lot of human development or former development, some old army bases up there. At one point, I was photographing bears in a rock quarry, which wasn't very natural looking. So there were some upsides and downsides to the character of the scenery there. But I wanted to try something different. Churchill has always been a really famous place for bear photography, and I think that there are good opportunities there. But I think you have to work a lot harder there than the place I go to in Alaska. So why don't we dive in, and we'll start off with some photos.
One more quick shout out.
Oh, sure.
Gilbert is loving that t-shirt.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all you physics fans out there. This is my Schrodinger's cat, wanted dead and alive.
Yes.
So, yes. And the rest of you who don't understand physics, you'll
just a cool shirt.
You'll just politely nod. It's a shirt about kitty cats. So.
All right, here we go.
All right, so we'll dive into the first image. So when I first got there, the weather was pretty brutal. It was this north wind that was coming over the Hudson Bay, but you can see in the background there's still open water. But it was snowing, it was cold, it was windy, and the bears don't really like this really cold, windy weather. They like the cold, but I don't think they like the wind. I mean, who does? So the bears tend to be a little less active on these windy days. You're more likely to see them kind of hunkered down, laying down. They'll kind of dig a little burrow in the snow and lay down or find a sheltered spot. But there were some bears wandering around, and I was shooting with my Tamron 150 to 600 millimeter lens. Tamron sent me one to use on this trip, so thank you very much to Tamron for that. And this is a shot I took of a bear who was just kind of wandering along the shore. Now, fun fact, I think this bear later ended up in bear jail. When the bears get too close to town, they will be tranquilized, and then they will be dragged into this concrete bunker where they keep the bears for some time before releasing them back into the wild far away from town. They kind of want to make the experience a little unpleasant for the bear, so it's not likely to come back into town because the bears that come into town, they can attack people. There can be injuries to the people that live there, to the tourists, or to the bears themselves, as officers try to keep the bears from harming people. So it's not good to have the bears come in so close to town. So I think that bear that I took a photo of in that picture ended up in bear jail and was released a few days later. So he was a naughty bear. Here's another example. I was talking about the rocky scenery here that you don't really have in Alaska. So this was a bear wandering around up on the rocks with some snow on him. So it was an opportunity to get some different scenery. I like playing with the patterns. There was this implied X shape that's created by the rocks, and the bear's almost standing in the middle. X marks the spot. So I'm always looking for moments where there's something interesting in the composition, some patterns, some lines, some shape that helps bring the composition together. And I do this even when I'm shooting wildlife. And usually I'm waiting for the wildlife to get into the right spot to fit in with that broader pattern in the landscape and bring the whole composition together. Now, a lot of my encounters in Churchill were rather static. The bears weren't doing anything interesting. They were typically just walking by, and so I'd get some pictures of the bears walking by. Every now and then they'd pause and take a look at me or something like that. Every now and then the bears would have this really big pause. Get it? Big pause? Sorry, bad joke. Bears have big pauses. What can I say? She thinks it's funny. She's laughing. Look at her.
I'm enjoying this a lot.
So I didn't get a lot of really active bears. I didn't see any bears that were fighting, unfortunately. And there were some cubs there, but I didn't get a lot of cubs playing or things like that. So a lot of these shots are okay shots, but they're really not what I was hoping to get, not what I was looking for. So there's a few other photos we can take a look at now. So next, here's a close-up encounter with a bear. So this bear ended up getting close enough to the vehicle that the guide had to beep on the horn to kind of scare it away. And when you're out there with the guides, you can get out of the vehicles, but you got to stay close to the vehicles. That way you can get a better position to shoot the bear. But if the bears come in close, everyone's got to run back into the vehicles really quick. These are very cute, but also very dangerous animals. And they can easily just rip a human being apart in a matter of seconds if they want to. So I'd rather not give the bear the opportunity. But it was nice as the bear was coming in closer to snap this shot. I'm looking for a dynamic pose. I'm looking for that eye contact. I'm looking for something that's going to make the overall composition more energetic and to bring some life to the photo and to tell a bit of a story. So this was a nice opportunity here. Here's another bear. Now this is a bear passing over that rock quarry I was talking about. Luckily there was snow all over the rocks, so it doesn't look obviously like a rock quarry. But you take what you can get. So here's the bear just crossing over the rocks. And once again, I get a moment where there's a bit of a dynamic pose and the bear is looking in my way. So that's a good moment to trigger the shutter and to get the shot. Now, bears weren't the only things that I was seeing up there. There were some other species that were photogenic, including Arctic fox, which are really ridiculously cute foxes. I mean, all foxes are pretty cute to begin with, but Arctic foxes are definitely the cutest of all foxes. They've got this brilliant white fur, and when they run, when it's windy, they're just so small, and they've got these big fluffy tails that the wind just kind of picks them up. So as they're running, they're just getting blown around by the wind, and it's really funny watching them run. I wish I had a video of that. Yeah, it's pretty cute.
No, I want to see an Arctic fox.
Yeah, well, you know where to go. They're incredible animals. They're adapted for the cold, just like the polar bears. So they actually survive these really cold winters on the land when most other animal species have departed or are hibernating or something like that. The polar bear and the Arctic fox are out there doing their thing. So it's really incredible to watch. And so, when I had the opportunity to photograph other animals, I did. So this particular Arctic fox was chewing on something that it had found, some piece of Arctic meat, tundra meat or something like that. I don't know. This was after it was done eating. It was cleaning itself off, so it was rolling around on the ground to clean itself off, and it paused for a moment, all curled up like that. And I like the eye contact. I like the shape, that curving shape it creates with his body when it's all curled up. I thought that was a dynamic pose and a good moment to trigger the shutter. And it's good having a zoom telephoto lens because that gives you the flexibility to zoom in and out as the animals are moving farther or closer to you. And you can also zoom in or out to choose how much of the background you want to include in the shot. So for this particular shot, the bear wasn't too far away from me. I was zooming out quite a bit. So I wasn't racked all the way out to 600 for this shot. I was probably at more like 200 or 300. And I zoomed out enough to include the little bit of the curve in the ice going around the bear, framing the bear. And then I also intentionally chose a position that had some of these grasses that were growing up coming in at the bottom of the frame just to add a little bit more visual interest and to add a little bit of depth. And it just so happened that as the bear walked by this particular spot, it lifted its head. They do that to sniff, to get a sense of what's up in front of them, to catch any sense in the wind. And that was a good moment to trigger the shutter. It was a nice dynamic pose that I think worked really well. I did see some cubs. There was one mother in particular with two cubs that was wandering around, and I think she and her cubs were the last bears left, by the time I left Churchill, most of the bears had scattered out to the ice, but this mother and her cubs were still hanging around. They probably by now are out on the ice, or they're getting ready to head out on the ice for the winter. So I got this moment where they were walking by, and all three of them were lined up, and all three of them were sniffing the wind to check things out. So that was a good moment. Having the three bears separated physically is something that I was looking for. When they get all bunched up, they kind of take on this single visual mass. So it's nice to have some visual separation. And once again, waiting for that dynamic pose, that pose where they're all alert, their posture is upright, they're looking up, you can see their eyes, you can see their faces. This is all very important for making successful wildlife photos. Here's another bear. Once again, walking through that rock quarry I was talking about earlier, but there's enough snow that you can't see the rock quarry, so it looks pretty natural, which is, I guess, all that I really need if I'm going to take a shot. So if I'm in an artificial environment, if it doesn't look artificial, then it's okay. No one will know unless I tell them, and I've already told you guys, so I've ruined the whole mystique of the photo. Once again, as I said, I was getting a lot of these static encounters where the bears weren't doing much. They were just kind of shambling around. So choosing your moment when the bear has got an alert posture, its head is up, when you've got one of its paws moving forward or being lifted up. These are all good moments to trigger the shutter because they can help make the overall composition look a little bit more dynamic, a little less static. And here's a big bear who was wandering around on the ice on a frozen lake, and it was at sunset, so there was a little bit of color in the sky behind him. These are tricky shots to take because you might have a lot of contrast between the background sky and the foreground. But luckily, there was a lot of snow on the ground. Snow reflects a lot of light, so the contrast was well within the range of my camera's dynamic range, of the ability of the sensor to capture light and dark at the same time. So I was able to get the shot and not overexpose any of the bright highlights in the sky. So having that little bit of color was certainly nice. Once again, as I said, these weren't the most exciting bear photos I've ever taken, but it was a pretty good trip, and there were some nice shots in the mix. And I think this is probably my favorite. This was a bear that was walking around on the ice and came up onto the icy shore. So these were a bunch of rocks that were just covered in ice. And this bear got pretty close. And there was a moment where he or she had this really dynamic pose and was looking right at me. And so I think of all the shots I took on the trip, this is probably the one that, in my opinion, came out the best. It's the one I like the most. But overall, I would say, if I were to grade this trip, I'd give it maybe a C or a C+ in terms of the photography that I've taken there. Relative, all things being relative, relative to my previous encounters with polar bears up in Alaska, it wasn't quite as good, but it's still a pretty good trip, and I bet most people would be very happy with polar bear images like this. But I'm always striving to take things to the next level, to make shots that are more artistic, to get more creative with my position, with my compositions, with the light that I'm using, and catching those really dynamic interactions between two or more animals, like looking for polar bears fighting or a mother and her cubs interacting. And unfortunately, I just didn't get that much interesting light during this trip, and just didn't have that many bear encounters and didn't get a lot of that higher concept stuff that I'm always looking for. So it was an okay trip, but not as successful as I would have liked it to be.
All right, are we all the way through the photos?
I think we are all the way through the photos. Yes, we are.
Well,
so now it's time for viewer questions and for a drink of water.
Absolutely. While he's taking a sip of water, just a quick reminder, you can always follow us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, and Twitter. And I'm going to start digging into the questions we have.
Before that,
yes?
I've got a fun water-related fact about polar bears. Polar bears don't really drink that much water because when they're out on the sea ice for long periods of time, there's no natural sources of fresh water out there. Obviously, there's like salt water and there's ice, but it's hard to like eat ice and then melt it and get water that way. So the way that bears get their water is they metabolize the fat that they build up eating seals. And when fat metabolizes, it releases water. So if you ever are thinking of going a long period of time without water, eat lots of seal before you go, and make sure to metabolize that fat while you're out there.
Be like a polar bear.
Exactly. So, sorry.
No,
Didn't mean to interrupt.
Okay. I was just going to say we do have some polar bear-based questions already in here. But remember, you can ask any questions at all. I believe you said exciting or daring questions.
I like daring. I like questions that are on the cutting edge,
That's
and
right.
I like questions that are funny.
So we're going to work our way through all of them. We do have quite a bit of time. I'll give you a warning when we're getting close to the cutoff to get any last-minute questions in, but let's go right for it.
Yes.
We've got one from Bill to get us started.
Hey, Bill.
When photographing water, for instance, a seascape of rocks with waves washing around them, I want to use a long exposure of several minutes to greatly soften the water, making for a hopefully ethereal look. If I use a 10-stop ND filter and extend the exposure time, do I have to worry about sensor heat or noise generated on very long exposures?
Yes. Sorry, go ahead.
Do you want me to continue?
Continue.
If so, can I take several shorter exposures and combine them to avoid this problem? What are the advantages and disadvantages of each method?
Okay, so it sounds to me, Bill, like you're trying to get that misty look. You want the water to blur so much that you lose all texture in it, and it kind of looks like mist floating around the rocks on the shore. And to get that, it really depends on how much water is moving back and forth. But usually you can get that misty look with an exposure of 30 seconds or 1 minute. You usually don't need like a super long exposure to get that misty look. And as I said, it will depend on the volume of water that's coming in and out and how quickly it's coming in and out. But usually you can get away with exposures that aren't too long. So the first thing to do to keep your exposures as short as possible is test a bunch of different exposures and find out the minimum amount of time you need to get that look that you're aiming for, that misty, ethereal look. So second of all, when you're doing really long exposures, the sensor can heat up and start generating, I have to eat some more seal fat, metabolize some water, and soften my palate here. It'll start generating this random pattern noise, and it will appear as colorful dots in your image. Now, most sensors that are out with modern cameras today won't really start generating this noise unless you start doing exposures that are over a few minutes long. And one way to get rid of that noise is to use your camera's automatic long exposure reduction mode. And what this will do is it will subtract any noise that appears because you have a long exposure. But the way it does this is by taking your basic exposure and then taking a second exposure, but that doesn't actually let any light into the sensor. It just opens up the sensor to recording information for the same period of time as your initial exposure. So if you take a 2-minute exposure, it'll spend another 2 minutes doing what's known as this dark frame exposure. And then from that, it'll figure out where to subtract the noise that occurred during your basic 2-minute exposure. So the bottom line is if you're using the long exposure reduction mode on your camera, it'll double your exposure time. So instead of a 2-minute exposure, you'll be sitting there waiting for 4 minutes for the shot to finalize. So it's best to avoid using long exposure reduction if you can, because it's just going to take longer. It's going to eat up your battery life. But that's one way of getting around the problem. So you shouldn't need long exposure noise reduction for the shorter 30-second to 1 minute or 2-minute exposures, but it depends on your camera and it depends on how advanced the camera is. Some of the older cameras, maybe some of the cheaper cameras will build up more noise during long exposures than some of the newer, more professional models. And so the other part of your question is whether you can take a bunch of shorter exposures and blend them together. And this is, of course, theoretically possible, but it might be a little bit difficult depending on several factors. I mean, first of all, these shorter exposures will have some texture and detail in the water, even if you've got long exposure blurring. So you might need a lot of them to blend on the computer to actually get that same ethereal look to your photos that you might get if you did a full 1 or 2 minute exposure. And second of all, you have to learn how to actually blend them. Some cameras will have these automatic modes for blending multiple exposures together, and if you've got that, great, use it. But for a lot of users, you're going to have to blend it manually using Photoshop, which is a really complicated process. And so it might be kind of challenging. So I think your best bet is to just aim for the shortest exposure that will give you the look that you want and hope that that exposure is short enough where you're not getting long exposure noise. And as I said, 30 seconds to 1 minute for most coastal scenes will probably do it for you.
Great. I am actually going to combine some of these questions. You'll see them dotted through here, talking specifically, asking about conditions on your trip, comparing. I'll give you a chance to kind of go back and recap some of that towards the end of the Q&A. Just know that I have seen some of those questions. We'll come back to that right at the end. Let's dig into something more specific here. We have a guest asking, what gear did you bring with you? You did talk about the Tamron lens, but what other things did you bring?
Well, I had a bunch of other lenses, but I never used them.
All right.
The 150 to 600 was perfect because
Great.
the bears, when they were far away, 600 was a great focal length. And as they got in closer, I never had to go any wider than 150. So I did have a few other lenses with me, but I never had a chance to use them. And flash is kind of frowned upon up there because the polar bears will react to it. And the last thing you want to do is make a bear really curious about something that's happening where you are. So I didn't bring any flash to augment the natural light. And so it was really basically, I could have just done this with one camera, one flash. Now the most important gear is not really, I'm sorry, one camera, one lens. The most important gear wasn't really the lens or the camera. The most important gear to have on a trip like this is warm weather gear because it was brutally cold, especially with that wind, and it was just hard to stay warm. And it's easier to keep your core warm, but your toes and your fingers get cold really fast. And what you want to do is make sure that your trigger finger stays warm enough that you can actually trigger the shutter button when something interesting is happening. And it's a challenge because you can't wear like a thick mitten on your trigger finger. You have to usually wear like a thinner liner glove because you need that dexterity to press the buttons on your camera. So that hand is prone to getting cold very, very fast. And it's always a challenge. Now, one thing that I didn't really have that I've been looking into, and I haven't really found that there are a lot of manufacturers making this, but what I'm looking for is some sort of like camera sleeve that is insulated, that's filled with down or something like that. So when you put your hand on the camera, it actually covers the area where the shutter is and allows you to have your hand in like a down mitten, but still have all the dexterity you need to press your button. So that's a good accessory, if you can find one, is some sort of camera cover that's insulated, that's built to stick your hand in to operate the camera controls while keeping you warm at the same time. Now, a lot of people try chemical hand warmers and toe warmers. They can help, but when your hand's exposed to the cold and the wind, with a thin liner glove, even with a chemical hand warmer, your fingers are going to get cold. So it's really a challenge staying warm. I learned that the best thing to do was just to conserve energy. If we got to a location and there were bears there, but the bears weren't very active, I sat in the car and stayed warm. I had all my camera gear ready, and as soon as the bears got active, I ran out. And I would see it all the time, lots of photographers who would be out there kind of waiting for that moment. And one by one, they would all end up, after 10 or 20 minutes, back in the car because they were getting so cold out there. So it's best to be smart about it and to conserve energy whenever you can. And so I stayed warm as long as I could. And that way, when the bears did get active, I was ready to go out there. I was warm enough to keep going for a while and get the action when it actually happened. Because if the action happens while you're out there waiting for it, it's no good if you're too frozen at that point to trigger the shutter.
That's great. You actually answered a question further down in the chat that was specific to how you kept your hands warm.
Excellent. I like it when things are efficient.
That's right. Let's move on then to a general question. What is the best season to photograph polar bears?
Well, absolutely. There's pretty much only one season, I guess. There's only one period during the year where you can really find the polar bears. It depends on where you are. But for places like Canada and Alaska, usually the bears don't start congregating on the shore until late in the summer. So in Alaska, it's usually in late August when they start gathering. And then you've got this short window of opportunity in early October when there's actually snow on the ground before the ice comes in, and then the bears disperse. So in Alaska, I would always be photographing in the first 2 weeks of October. And as you get towards the end of the first 2 weeks, there's always a risk that that sea ice will come in and the bears will disappear. And with Churchill, it's about a month later than that. The bears start congregating, I think, late August and in October, late September and October. And then by mid-November, or by the end of November, they're usually gone. Now, there's another place in the world where you can do polar bear photography. I haven't been there. It's the Svalbard Islands in Norway. And I think that the bears kind of are roaming around on the pack ice out there throughout the year. So in the summer, when the cruises go into the islands looking for polar bears, you can see them, in August and September. So I think the summer is a good time for that. There are some places in Churchill where tours are taking people into polar bear denning areas. So polar bears don't hibernate; they don't den unless it's a pregnant female. and then she'll create a den to give birth and to raise her infants. And so there's some places where you can go in like February or March to these polar bear denning areas and see the moms and their cubs as they emerge from the dens. So that's another good time to photograph bears as well.
Now, Dee had a question later on in the chat. Have you ever photographed the bears in Norway?
I have not photographed the bears in Norway. So, as I said, I think Alaska, where I've been, is very, very productive. There's lots of bears, and so you're pretty much guaranteed to see and photograph lots of bears when you're there. Churchill, the concentration of bears is a lot less. So it's much more difficult to find bears and to get the shots that you want. So there's a lot less opportunities, so it's a lot less productive. And I think Norway is even harder to find bears. So in Norway, you've got a lot of beautiful scenery. You've got bears wandering around on the ice floes and things like that. And the Svalbard Islands are very rocky with, they've got some vertical relief as well. You've got some hills and mountains in the background, I think. But it's much more difficult. So I've heard stories about people going into Svalbard and maybe a week of cruising, they might see 1 or 2 or 3 bears, and they might not even get that close. I think the tours there are getting better at finding bears. But my impression is that the bears are even less concentrated than they are in Churchill. In Churchill, the bears are less concentrated than they are on Barter Island in Alaska.
All right, good answer. Maybe one day, Norway. Yeah. I'll have to go to Norway.
Yeah, I mean, it would definitely be a different environment.
He said in summer, that's my jam.
Yes, Norway in summer, that's about as warm as it gets. So, it's tropical.
Our next question is coming in from Jeff. Jeff wants to know, how much time do you spend learning about your subjects before you photograph them?
Jeff, that's a really good question, and I think it's important, no matter what type of photography you do, that you do understand your subject. And it may not necessarily be vital to learn everything about it before you show up to photograph, but at the very least, when you're in the field working with your subject, you got to pay close attention to what the subject is doing and attune yourself to its rhythms. So whether it's a landscape, whether it's people when I'm traveling, or whether it's wildlife, I do spend as much time when I'm in the field trying to understand how the subject behaves, how the local conditions, like the local weather and the local light conditions, and how they might interact with the subject. I tend to do more of that than any sort of pre-planning. I'm not much of a planner. I'm more of a reactor, I guess. And that's the same no matter what type of landscape I do. But I do think it's important that you learn something about your subject. But it may not be necessary to like spend days or hours researching a wildlife subject before you go photograph it. I think it depends on the subject. A lot of times, if you're working by yourself, I think that's more important. But if you're working with local guides, you can rely on their expertise. They know how the animals act. They know where to find the animals. They know how the animals are going to move throughout the landscape. They know how the animals are going to react to where you are and what you're trying to do. And they're there to help you to facilitate your efforts to get the shots that you want.
All right, I'm going to try to get your name right here. It's Alina or Elena. Forgive me if I chose wrong. Alina is asking, how long do you stay in one location, tripod ready, before moving on?
Great question. I mean, I guess that depends on what I'm shooting. If it was for the bears, for example, it really depends on the bear. Like, with wildlife, you got to let your wildlife subject be your guide. And unless you know an animal's coming your way, I don't necessarily just set up in a random spot and just kind of wait for something to happen. Usually I spend a lot of time going out there trying to find the animal. And then if the animal's active, I'll be out shooting. If the animal's not active, I will sit there and wait, typically, and wait for the animal to get active. Sometimes it just requires you to wait for an hour or two before that sleeping polar bear gets up, shakes itself off, and does an Irish jig right in front of everyone. And so you want to be ready when that happens. But a lot of times I may decide to go try something else. Like I might see a bear sleeping and think, you know what, this bear is sleeping. Even if it gets up, I don't think this is a particularly good spot for shooting. I'm going to go see if I can find another bear. Now with landscape photography, I spend a lot of time scouting for good compositions. And once I find the compositions I want, then it's a matter of waiting for the right light and the right weather conditions to bring it all together. So I might be going back to that spot at sunset or sunrise multiple times. So, I might be on that location with my tripod an hour before sunset, and I might do 5 sunsets in a row at the same spot until I finally get the light that I want. Sometimes it's 30 sunsets before I finally get the light that I want. So I do spend a lot of time working with a small select group of compositions when I'm doing landscape work, just waiting for those magical moments to bring it all together.
We've got a question from the other Ian.
The other
There
Ian.
must only be one other.
That's right. There can be only one.
Oh, the competition begins. Well, the other Ian is asking, is it hard to separate the color of the bear from the background, white on white? How do you make the bear stand out?
Oh, well, that's actually a really good question. So it turns out that the polar bears really aren't that white. And you can see this especially when they're on a white background, a snowy background. The bears are sometimes a little yellowish or brownish, so they actually stand out. The bigger challenge isn't getting them to stand out from the snow or the ice, which they tend to do quite well. It is when there's a lot of snow in the air. So if you've got a blizzard, then you've got a lot of white in front of the bear, a lot of white behind the bear, and there's not a lot of visual acuity. And that's the real challenge. I mean, I was shooting in almost near whiteout conditions a lot of times. And the end result might be a bear that just looks like a ghost image that barely arises from that white background and that white snow that's actually in the foreground in between you and the bear. And those are the most challenging conditions. When you're with the bears and they're actually doing some cool stuff and you're shooting through these near whiteout conditions and you can barely see the bear at all, it's a real challenge and there's not much you can do in that case. If the snow's just come down too hard and too fast, you're just going to lose all of that contrast in the scene. It can be really cool. Some of my favorite polar bear images have been taken in those sort of whiteout conditions. But also sometimes it can be too much. You just don't really have any ability to see the bear. And if you try to add some contrast, if you go in with like the dehaze filter in Adobe Lightroom or add contrast or just bring the blacks down, you lose some of that magic, that ethereal look you get when you have all that snow blowing around the bear. And also it starts looking really kind of garish and artificial, so it's really hard to recover that detail if it's not there to begin with. So, what they say, sometimes you eat the bear, sometimes the bear eats you. Sometimes you got enough snow in the air to add this magical element to the photos, but sometimes it's just too much, and you can't separate the bear from all the snow. And that's just the way it is. It's just the way the cookie crumbles.
Let's move on to Jorge's question.
Hello, Jorge.
Hi. Are most of the wildlife photos you've taken been using a tripod or handheld?
That's a good question. It really depends. I do use a tripod a lot when I'm shooting wildlife, but if it's in a place like Africa where you're on a safari or when you're on a land safari in a place like Churchill, you're in a vehicle. And so in cases like that, more often than not, I might be shooting with some sort of like beanbag support or some sort of like maybe small tripod that just gives me a little bit of support, resting it on the side of the vehicle or on the hood of the vehicle or something like that. So in those cases, I'm not using a tripod. And on a lot of shoots with wildlife, I am shooting handheld because a lot of times the wildlife is moving around really quickly and unpredictably, and it's hard to get a tripod in position to keep up with the animal. So in cases like that, I'll be shooting handheld as much as possible, though I do try to get some sort of support. Like you can get like a shoulder stock that gives you some support. I was using basically this almost like a small monopod that I would extend so that it would hit, the bottom of the monopod would dig into my waist, and then I would have the camera on top of it. And that would give me enough support to help keep my hands a bit steadier and to get the weight off my arms so I could shoot for longer and get better shots. And so I just was resting it against my waist or against my stomach just to get that little extra bit of support. And it gave me all the flexibility I needed. I could move around. I didn't have to worry about trying to get a monopod or a tripod into position on the ground. I just jam it into my stomach, and it worked just fine. It gave me that little extra bit of support, and I still had all the flexibility I needed.
All right, let's move on. Jim has a pretty quick question here. How many people were in your group?
So I had a guide, and then I had 2 friends with me. So it was a total of 4 people in the car.
All right. Max has a question. We're going a little bit back to the cold weather here on this one.
All right.
What are some gear preparation tips for photography out in the cold so I don't freeze? I'm going to edit the end of that question for you there,
Freeze
Max.
my butt off?
Close, very close.
Oh, he used the A word.
Not quite.
Not quite.
But close.
Oh,
got any
right.
secret
The other B word.
tips? So
Yes.
I know you talked about that fancy camera.
Well, okay, so tip number 1, whatever you do, if you're going into a cold weather environment, try to find another cold weather environment where you can test your gear before you're there. Because the last thing you want to do is show up and find out you're underprepared, which is kind of what happened to me here in Churchill. I had recently replaced a winter jacket, and the new jacket wasn't nearly as warm as the old jacket. I just never had a chance to really test it and figure that out ahead of time. So first thing, dress in layers, lots and lots of layers. So I always have base layers. I'm wearing thermal underwear. I'll wear a t-shirt over my thermal top. I'll have a pair of pants under, and another fleece jacket on top of the thermal underwear, and then I'll have maybe another thermal, what do they call it? The artificial fill. It's escaping me. It's not down, but it's artificial, like Primaloft or something like that. Have a small Primaloft sweater, and then over that goes a big down jacket. I've got thin liner gloves in my hands for dexterity, and then I stick my hands into big, thick down gloves to keep them warm. And when I'm shooting, I'll take my right hand out of the glove and just use the mitten, so I have that dexterity to trigger the shutter. But I keep the glove on my left hand holding the camera, so that hand stays warm as long as possible. And when my trigger finger gets cold, I'll stick it into a pocket, try to warm it up. You can try to find one of those insulated camera covers to keep your hand a little bit warmer. Chemical hand warmers and foot warmers can be useful, as well as battery-powered socks and battery-powered gloves. Those do exist, and they can help some as well, though when it gets really bitterly cold, there's not much you can do about it. But whatever you do, make sure that if you get an opportunity, test all your equipment. Go out and just sit out there for an hour and see what happens to your fingers and your toes. If they get cold after being outside for an hour without moving around, then you're probably not warm enough. You need to upgrade your gear or figure out a way to keep your fingers and toes warmer. Because a lot of times when you're shooting wildlife in the winter, you're not really moving around. You're waiting for the wildlife to get up and do something. And if you're not moving, you're not generating heat, it's harder to stay warm. So you want to make sure that you can be comfortable for long periods of time, even when you're not doing anything.
Oh, that would be tough for me.
Yeah. And what I do when I do start getting cold, you'll see me out there doing jumping jacks, running in place, get that core temperature up. If you can keep your core temperature warm, your extremities will stay warm as well.
That will help a lot. All right, let's move on to a little more specific now from a question from a guest here. Mm-hmm. Do you work the shot by varying f-stop, or are you just so good that you know the f-stop you want from the moment you set up the shot?
Well, so it depends on what you're shooting. So with wildlife, more often than not, you're shooting wide open. You're using a big f-stop because you just want to have selective focus on your subject. You want that background to blur out a little bit. Sometimes you want more depth of field with wildlife, but almost always you don't. So I'm typically shooting wide open or close to wide open. To me, the more important variable when shooting wildlife is my shutter speed. And I want to make sure I've got a fast enough shutter speed to prevent any camera shake if I'm shooting handheld, or also to freeze the motion of a moving animal. So even the polar bears, when they're kind of shambling by, they're not moving that fast, but when they move their paws forward, those front paws, they move really quickly. There's this sudden movement, and if you're not at 1/800th of a second or 1/1000th of a second, you're going to get a little bit of blur in that movement. So a lot of times I'm shooting at very fast shutter speeds, and I shoot with wildlife typically in shutter priority mode. And I let my ISO float, so I set my ISO to auto, so I don't have to worry about my ISO if light conditions are changing. And I set the shutter speed, and almost always I'm not working in super bright middle of the day conditions with wildlife, so that typically means that by default, the camera is picking pretty much that wide open aperture. So the only time I might be thinking about aperture is if it's so bright out that even at a fast shutter speed and a low ISO, I'm still open aperture. I've got to figure out some camera settings that are going to get me there.
Right. Mm-hmm. Let's move on to Danny's question.
Hello, Danny.
Danny asks, do you have any recommendations for adjusting your computer screen resolution to make sure you get the right color corrections and it doesn't turn out like your colorblind uncle threw a bunch of filters on it?
Okay, so that's a wonderfully phrased question. I'm glad that you phrased it in the form of a joke, which is why we picked it.
Perfect.
But it's also a very good question. So your screen resolution really has nothing to do with the way the colors look. What you're really going to need to do to make sure that what you see is what you get when you edit a photo is that, first of all, you have a good monitor that you shouldn't be out there buying the cheapest monitor you can get. Like try to get a monitor that's got a wide color gamut and that's got a pretty good contrast range. But second of all, once you get a good monitor, you want to make sure that the monitor is calibrated to an international standard. And there's a number of devices out there you can buy that will allow you to easily calibrate your monitor. So one really popular one is called the Spyder, that's S-P-Y-D-E-R. There's another one called Color Monkey, and that's M-U-N-K-I. All these clever spellings of these very typical words. Those are two color calibration devices that are very popular, and a lot of people use them. And once you've got a good monitor and you've got it calibrated, then what you see is what you get. If you were to output that file to the internet, it should more or less look pretty much the way it looks on your computer. If you send that image into a professional lab for printing, the result that you get back should look pretty close to what you see on your monitor. So color calibration is the key to make sure that it doesn't look like your blind uncle processed the photo. Or is that colorblind uncle? Or?
Colorblind uncle.
Colorblind uncle, yes.
Very specific. We're going to take just a brief pause. I have seen a couple questions in here pop up about the wildlife photo contest. So if you're following along in the chat, we are still running that contest all the way through November 30th. And you will actually see a direct link that's been provided there for you with all the specific rules. So if you're wondering what it is that the criteria will be for the judging of the different photos, or even you want to check out the prizes more specifically, you can go ahead and click there through the chat box. And again, you can find any additional information with the banner under the video or the link in the description, especially if you want to slide in some photos of your own to put forward. That sounds like a fun thing to participate in, especially as we're talking through so much wildlife this Q&A. So let's move on to a pretty fun question here from a guest. What is the most difficult animal you have had to photograph? A cheetah after 4 Red Bulls? And specifically, I mean the cheetah had the 4 Red Bulls.
Right. And so that could be the cheetah took down 4 bulls who happened to be red, or the cheetah drank 4 Red Bull drinks. Either way, that's an impressive cheetah. Mm-hmm. So, this is a really good question. I'm going to have to think about that for a moment because there have been definitely some challenging shoots that I've had. Let me think about that. That's a good question. I think one of the most challenging things I've ever done is trying to photograph bald eagles coming down to the water to grab a fish. That's a really challenging thing to get. And I learned, there's all these dirty little secrets in wildlife photography. And I learned that a lot of the photos that you see of eagles coming down to grab the water, that some photographers figured out that if you throw a plastic milk jug in the water, the eagle will come down and try to grab it. So they would I don't know. You hear all these weird stories. I don't know if they're true or not. But and then it turns out there was also this woman up in Homer, Alaska, that was feeding all these bald eagles. She became known as the Eagle Lady. So there's for decades there were people getting photographs of bald eagles coming down to grab a fish. They were just being fed by this lady who was tossing fish into the water, and photographers would go. I think they would pay her so they could photograph the eagles. Yeah. So stupid me, I was trying to do it the old-fashioned way. I was trying to actually get a photo of a bald eagle in the wild coming down and hitting the water with its talons to get a fish. And it was maddening trying to get this because you might see the eagle flying, but when they just drop all of a sudden in a really unpredictable fashion. And then you've got to be able to react quick enough to get your camera on the spot and focused when the eagle hits the water. And it was just driving me nuts. And then I learned, the dark secrets of how people were actually getting these shots. And I said, you know what? I give up. There's no way I'm going to do this naturally. I'm not going to do some plastic milk jug thing. So I just gave up and never ever got a shot of a bald eagle trying to get a fish out of the water. So I would think that was arguably the most difficult thing I've ever tried with wildlife photography.
Should have made friends with the Eagle Lady.
Too late now. She's crossed over.
Oh. Yeah. That's okay. She left a legacy behind.
She did. She did.
Our next question comes from somebody who has titled themselves McMoose.
McMoose?
Yes.
All right.
McMoose is asking, how often do you go out to shoot a particular species? And then how often do you go out just to see what you see?
That's a great question. Is that McMoose as in M-I-C-K Mick? Or is it McMoose as in he's...
M-C-M-O-O-S-E.
Ooh, impressive. Mm-hmm. Okay. I like that. Yeah, so usually when I'm out photographing wildlife, I'm there for a particular species. So I'm not usually just taking a walk in the woods hoping to see whatever I see. I used to do that in the past, but now I tend to be pretty focused. I'm not really what I would consider a wildlife photographer. I probably do more landscape than I do wildlife. And when I do wildlife, I'm usually focused on a particular species. Or if I'm going to a place like Africa, you know that there's going to be a lot of different species that you might be able to photograph. So I may not necessarily be there just for the lions, for example. I may be there to photograph the lions, the cheetahs, the leopards, especially that cheetah who drank the 4 Red Bulls, who is now leaping over the elephant. And I want to get a picture of that. So, when you're on safari in Africa, it's usually let's just see what we can find. But in other instances, I'm usually pretty focused on the particular species that I want to photograph.
We've got a few questions in from guests. The first one is, do you have any tips for shooting in stormy conditions? Do you have a certain clamp for an umbrella that attaches to your tripod, or any specific lens and camera body cloths for drying your equipment in the field?
Well, yeah, it's funny. I used to do a lot of photography in the rain, and I just gave up years ago because I found that if it was raining hard enough, you really just couldn't keep your stuff dry, that it was just getting wet too much. And I got a small umbrella that I hooked up to one of those flexible clamps. I think they call them plamps or something like that. They're designed to, like a lot of photographers use them to move plants around. Like if they're trying to photograph a flower, they'll clamp it with this flexible clamp to hold it in place so they can get a photo of it. So I would just hook the umbrella up to that. And it worked great unless it was windy. And if it was windy, then I just knocked the whole camera over. And that was always a problem. And the best thing you can do is to carry a lot of lens cloths with you to dry off your lens. And have a lot of them, because once those cloths get wet, they can't absorb any more moisture, and you just cannot get your lens dry enough. And this is particularly problematic if you've got like a windy and rainy day and the spray is just blowing on your lens. If you're photographing at the base of a waterfall and there's a lot of spray, the lens is going to get sprayed up pretty quickly, and you constantly have to wipe it dry. The trick I've learned for that is that I'll set up my composition, and while I'm setting up my composition, all that spray will be blowing onto the lens. So what I'll do is I'll cover the camera and then wipe it clean. And then I'll wait for the moment when I want to actually take the shot. And I'll have everything ready. I'll have my electronic release in my hand, my finger on the trigger, and I'll rip off whatever is covering the lens, take a quick shot, and throw the cover back over and clean the lens again. You've got like a few seconds before the spray builds up so much that it ruins the picture. So usually if you follow this method, you can actually get shots that don't look completely ruined by the spray building up.
Nice. Let's move on to a question from a different guest. I realize that light is a super important element of photography. Outside, I don't have complete control of the light, but I can select the time when I shoot. Composition has been a challenge for me. How do I master it?
Well, you can start off by buying my ebook, Visual Flow, Mastering the Art of Composition, which is available on the OPG shop. It is a really in-depth dive into composition written by me, and I think you'll find it very, very helpful in mastering composition. Composition is a difficult thing. To me, it is really what separates every photographer from every other photographer. That's how you express your artistic vision. So learning how composition works and how you can tailor it to your own personal artistic approach, I think is vitally important, because it's your way of telling your story when you make photographs. So instead of just photographing stuff, taking snapshots of things, you create a composition and you show the world what you see, your artistic vision. So I think it's vitally important for every photographer to study composition, and I think there's no better resource than my book, Visual Flow.
Perfect. We got another question coming in from Dee. How did you keep your batteries warm to avoid losing charge in the cold?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The funny thing is I never had to recharge. The whole week I was shooting, I didn't recharge my batteries once. Lithium-ion batteries actually handle the cold pretty well. I had a grip on my camera that took 2 batteries at the same time. And by the end of the trip, I still had half of the battery power left. So it actually wasn't a problem. But if you do find that the cold is draining your batteries, there's a few things you can do. First of all, have some spares that are fully charged. Keep the spares in a warm pocket. as your main battery begins to die down, take it out, put it into a warm pocket, put in one of the spares. If you're really worried about the cold sapping your batteries, keep them in a warm pocket until you're ready to shoot, and then put them into your camera. But by and large, most modern lithium-ion batteries will actually handle the cold weather pretty well. And I think you'll find that with most camera systems, your batteries really aren't draining at a rate that's much faster than they normally would.
Great. Paula's got another equipment question.
All right.
Did you have lens fogging after taking the camera gear out of the warmer interior of the car into the much colder outdoor environment?
I never had lens fogging problems at all, mainly because the warm interior of the car was never really all that warm. Like, you know, it's probably, you're dressed in all this heavy winter equipment. So when you're inside the car, you don't want to be blasting the heat to the point where you're just drowning in sweat. So, you know, it was still pretty cool in the car. But the best way to avoid that sort of fogging is that just make sure your lens cap is on over your camera as you go in and out. Usually it's more of a problem when everything is cold and you come into a warm, moist environment. So when you come back in, almost always the best thing you can do is make sure your lens cap is on. And if you're really worried about it, put your camera back in a camera bag and close the camera bag before you come back into the warm room or the warm car. That way, the equipment will kind of warm up gradually inside the bag. The bag will insulate it, kind of keep it cooler longer, and that should help prevent condensation from forming on your camera or your lens.
We have got time for one more question,
and
then maybe a quick recap from what we started with at the very beginning. We've got a question from Ed. When holding the camera by handheld, which lens would you use?
Well, so when I was up in Churchill, I was, just shooting with the Tamron 150 to 600. So I did work with that handheld a lot. It's a bigger lens, it's a bit heavier. But if you've got a little extra support, like as I said, having maybe a small monopod that's just kind of jammed into your hip or something like that, it actually helps stabilize the lens a bit, and it keeps a lot of the weight off your arms. So you can hold it for longer, but still have all the flexibility you want. So there definitely are some heavy telephoto lenses out there that are much harder to handhold, but there are ways to take some of that weight off of your arms and make the experience much more productive for you.
All right, to finish us off today for this Q&A session, I'm going to let Ian kind of conglomerate all of these other questions that I'm going to put together right here, just in case you missed the very beginning when Ian was kind of giving us some insight onto his trip that he just returned from. We have some questions asking about the quality of the shooting conditions on your trip, what kind of gear you brought with you, how close the polar bears were getting, and how the weather was for you. So a quick recap just to send us off would be great.
The weather was miserable. It was cold and windy and snowy. The polar bears were too often too far away, but on occasion they were pretty close. The closest I got was, I would say, maybe 40 feet away from a polar bear, which is exciting. The most important gear was the cold weather gear, because if you're cold, you're not taking any pictures. And what was the last part of that multiple part question?
I believe the weather and the lighting shooting conditions. Let me scroll back up. Oh, did you ever get nervous about your safety with the closeness to the polar bears?
No, I never got nervous about the safety. The guide I was working with was excellent. Whenever the bears got close, he was very authoritative. He just said, get in the car now, and I obeyed what he did. That's the best thing you can do, is when you're working with a guide, that's his or her job, is to keep you safe. And if you're working with someone good and you know you're going to pay attention to what they say, then you shouldn't have any problems. It's when you break the rules, it's when you do what you're not supposed to do, when you don't listen to your guide, that's when you should be nervous. But I always travel with a slower and tastier friend. You don't have to outrun the bear, you just have to outrun the guy next to you.
Exactly.
So, no, I never felt unsafe. Wild animals are, of course, unpredictable. Anything can happen. But as long as you treat them with respect and you respect the rules laid down by the people that you're working with, then you shouldn't have any problems. You should have a great time, and you should get some great shots. So don't be afraid. Get out there, find yourself the right polar bear guide, and have a polar bear good time.
That's a great wrap up for all of the questions. Thank you so much for continuing to interact the entire hour. Just like that, it's about time.
Well, thank you very much for joining us on this exciting episode of OPG Live. We'll be back again next month with an even more exciting episode of OPG Live. I don't know what I'm going to be doing. I don't have any trips planned for the rest of the month, so I'm not going to have any new photos to share, but I'll come up with something exciting to talk about. And as always, I will answer your questions. I'm Ian Plant.
I'm Leah Zahner.
And thanks for watching. Bye.